So while listening to Twice's most recent comeback, Alcohol Free, one of the best parts of the soothing bossa nova style of the song is that it brought back a bit of nostalgia from my first time visiting Cancun. That's where I discovered my favorite cocktail, the pina colada. The only problem is that I was never a big drinker, but then I discovered you could order it without alcohol, and yikes, that was a mistake. I mean, you know it's bad when the bartender doesn't even ask you what you want, just hands you the drink? I gained like 5 pounds on a 2-week trip. Anyway, this nostalgic serenity was shattered when I started seeing some recent articles and posts on Korean forums heavily debating whether or not Twice will disband. And many of the commenters also seem to be experts in psychology and body language because they go on into great detail about how Twice looks so tired. And some even claiming that they look lazy on stage, that this is a sure sign they've lost desire to be idols. Really? Well, as a fan, I've watched all of their live stages, and these netizens must have seen something I didn't. So, let me take a look here. Oh, yeah, I see what they mean. Yeah, they totally look tired and lazy. I mean, those extra bright smiles and synchronized movements are dead giveaways, don't you think? Oh, yeah, look at that. They even changed their choreo to incorporate inside jokes only their fans would recognize. Yep, clearly a sign they don't want to be idols anymore. Especially her. Wow. Yeah, way to phone in your performance, Jiho. Jeez. She should be ashamed of herself. Idiotic netizen comments aside, this does bring up an interesting discussion. You see, Twice are currently in the 6th year of their career, just 1 year away from the dreaded 7-year curse of K-pop. This is a reference to the fact that a very few number of K-pop groups make it past the 7-year mark. Well, here's a revelation for you. It's not because they're cursed. 7 years happens to be the most common K-pop contract length. You see, back in the day, some K-pop companies, SM, would lock in their idols to ridiculous contract lengths, some as high as 13 years. In 2009, the Korean Department of Labor stepped in and set a maximum cap on idols' contracts to 7 years. With K-pop companies wanting to maximize their investment, it was only natural for 7 years to become the standard K-pop contract length. Now, whether or not a group decides to extend that contract depends on several different factors. That being said, wouldn't it be cool if there's a way to predict whether or not your favorite K-pop group will disband at the end of their contract? Well, it's a good thing you're here because only a few idiots like me will go out of their way to create non-practical metrics just to make completely inaccurate predictions. Now, if you're a sports fan, the process involves a similar concept to advanced performance metrics. So for K-pop idols, the most important factor here is what happens between years 6 and 7 of their contract. The idea is to measure a group's average album sale numbers and combine them with their average unique listeners from domestic streaming platforms, that of which would give you a general indication of their public popularity in Korea. This creates what I call, for a lack of a better phrase, success metric. When you consider most K-pop idols will reach their peak success between years 3 and 5, any kind of drop-off in years 6 through 7 can then be converted into a numerical value. Basically, any group below this 50% line are unlikely to renew. Now, before you go too deep into the numbers, I admit this is a very rough estimate hack job. Especially inaccurate are the unique listeners data due to the fact that streaming sites routinely change the way they report these numbers. I also kindly remind you that my channel is called Kpop Theorist and not Kpop Data Analyst, so don't take this whole thing too seriously. Now, for an example of how these numbers work, for a group like Gfriend, in their last 2 years they experienced a drop of 24% in average sales per album, while dropping 40% in average unique listeners per song. Which is sad because personally I thought Mago was one of the best K-pop songs of last year. Anyway, that gives us an average decline of minus 32. Now, if 50 is the median baseline, meaning this line represents groups who were consistent throughout the last 2 years, then Gfriend's score would place them around 18% chance of renewing. And sure enough, earlier this year, Gfriend opted not to extend their contract with Source Music. Now, when you apply this metric to currently disbanded groups, it's surprisingly pretty accurate. Quite a few groups fall into this category, including 21, Sistar, 4 Minute, BAP, 2AM, Stellar, Hello Venus, Miss A, GOT7. Or maybe it is a curse. Of course, there are anomalies such as A-Pink, who would have been ranked 28% but extended their contracts anyway, so this obviously isn't a perfect metric. The main thing to understand is that this is actually normal. You see, K-pop, or the pop music genre in general, has always been targeted towards young people. It's virtually impossible to sustain a high level of success for 7 years. It's called aging. And as you and your favorite group get older, younger groups and thus younger fans take their place. So it's natural for album sales and popularity to decline over time. Despite all this, some groups defy logic and somehow continue to sustain their success past the 6-year mark, often leading them to extend their contracts. Some of those groups include Girls' Generation, SHINee, Super Junior, a lot of SM groups for some reason, Big Bang, and most recently Mamamoo. And then you have the real anomalies, groups that actually increase their success in their later years, or the late bloomers, groups like Kara, who achieved much of their success later in their career, especially in Japan. You also have 17, who despite having a 34% drop in unique listeners, managed to gain a ridiculous 118% increase in album sales. That would have scored them a 92% chance of renewal, and very recently they did just that. And of course there's BTS, who according to my metric would jump off the graph, so it's no surprise they renewed their contract in 2018. Now it's time to have some fun and make a few predictions for the future. Now here's some K-pop groups heading into their last years of their contract. Now let's find out if I have a potential career as a K-pop prediction channel. Oh My Girls certainly saw a huge resurgence in recent years. With an increase of 71% in sales and 25% increase in popularity, I'd give them about a 98% chance of extending their contracts. On the opposite side, you have Lovelyz, a group that has had a 23% drop in sales and 60% drop in unique listeners, and that would give them a pretty slim chance of renewal at around 8%. A couple boy groups like Winner and Monster X are right around the middle line, giving them about a 50-50 chance, and veteran group Red Velvet is close to this line as well at around 40%, but that could change in either direction depending on the results of their most recent comeback. So where does Twice fit into this metric? Well, as a fan, I hate to admit this, but clearly they've been declining in popularity domestically. Unique listeners, endorsements, chart performance have all steadily declined in the past 3 years. Now back in 2018, if Twice released a song where they farted into a microphone for 3 minutes, it would have just debuted #1, no questions asked. Now those days are clearly gone. Their unique listeners numbers dropped by an astonishing 52%. That's one of the largest drops on this list, only surpassed by Lovelyz with a drop of 60%. So is it time for ones to get worried? Well, not so fast, because Twice are also a bit of an anomaly, similar to 17. Generally, when an idol group declines in popularity, their sales tend to decline with it. For 17 and Twice, their album sales have actually increased by a lot. For Twice, a whopping 53% increase. That's even more impressive that when you consider by 2019, Twice were already the highest selling K-pop girl group of all time, and they actually improved on those numbers in the past 2 years. What this all means is that while their popularity with the Korean general public is decreasing, their fandom is actually increasing. Now this is a good time to distinguish the difference between having fans versus being popular. The general public will gladly listen to an idol's music as long as it's free, but only fans will actually pay for albums and attend concerts. So when you see a group like Brave Girls today, their resurgence in popularity is great for winning trophies and getting endorsements, but their ultimate endgame is converting that popularity into an actual fandom which leads to maximum income and longevity. And this brings up an interesting question. If the Korean general public have lost interest in Twice, then where are all these new fans coming from? And the answer is pretty obvious: outside of Korea. Now besides the fact that JYP himself does kind of look like a dancing gorilla, I'll assume that the rest of JYP Entertainment isn't run by a bunch of monkeys. In fact, they seem to have recognized the lack of domestic growth and have slowly begun pushing Twice into international markets. Their most recent albums have been made available for purchase at American retail outlets such as Target and Barnes & Noble. And there are considerably more Western publication interviews and promotions. In fact, the debut performance of their most recent comeback, Alcohol Free, was on an American talk show. And wouldn't you know it, Twice just announced an English single coming out this September. Now, many Korean Twice fans actually despise this action, blaming this on JYP's American disease, or some would say his desperate desire for Western validation. But they should look at it this way. Imagine you have an oil rig, and after a few years of drilling, it finally runs empty. There's no oil left to drill. Well, you don't keep drilling until you crack the center of the earth. The smart decision is to move oil rigs, this time to a new market. You see, statistics show that there's no new fans left in Korea, but there's a much larger possible market here in the US. Testing the Western market is just the next logical choice because there's no downside, but a huge potential upside. How much of an upside? Here's a fun quiz. The Beatles, Spice Girls, Shakira, even Blackpink and Psy. What do all of these artists have in common? Well, they were all big stars in their home country before reaching a Western audience. Notice who's not on this list? That's right. You see, BTS is one of the rarest cases where their international popularity directly increased their domestic fame. This is the end of the year Korean Gallup poll from 2017. While BTS did rank first with teens, they actually ranked lower than TWICE for folks in their 20s and 30s, and didn't even make the top 10 for 40s and 50s age group. Then you fast forward 1 year, performance on Dick Clark's New York Rockin' Eve, a couple People's Choice Awards, performing at the AMAs, becoming the first K-pop group to appear on cover of Billboard, a YouTube premium documentary, performing on several American talk shows, and becoming the first Korean act to top the Billboard 200. And now they were ranked first with teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and even broke the top 10 for the 50 and up crowd. Yes, by this time, even my mom was a fan of BTS. And her bias is V, if you're wondering. If you want to see a hilarious story, check out comedian Bobby Lee talk about his mom's obsession with BTS. I'll leave a link below. A fun fact, Bobby Lee starred in the Wonder Girls music video for 2 different tiers. You can see how success in the Western music market can do wonders for a group in terms of gaining domestic attention. And while I don't expect TWICE to have the same level of success as BTS or Blackpink in the West, they don't necessarily have to. You see, with the release of their most recent album in the US outlets, TWICE peaked at number 6 for the Billboard 200 album chart, and was the best-selling album in the US for the week. As this news started making the rounds in Korean media outlets, just like clockwork, their Korean chart positions increased, all while trending number 1 on several Korean search portals. You see, just a little bit of success in the West would ensure TWICE's positions on this metric chart, with unlimited potential for growth. But if you really just wanted a straight-up answer regarding TWICE, I'll be honest, most of this stuff is just nonsensical filler. I mean, you don't need silly metric data to predict whether or not a group will extend their contract. You see, while all of these half-witted netizens are arguing over TWICE's desire to continue as idols, they're overlooking the most important factor: the actual company responsible for re-signing them. Specifically, in business terms, you have to look at the leverage dynamic between the two sides. You see, in a capitalist society, nobody is paid what they deserve. They're paid based on how much leverage they have over the person paying them. If the artist has enough leverage over the company, it really doesn't matter how much they hate their job as idols. The company will often find a way to convince them. This is why often the income distribution is much more favorable for the idols who extend their contracts. So then how much leverage does TWICE have over JYP Entertainment? Well, here's a visual aid for you. Now, this chart shows the past 5 years of album sales for JYP Entertainment, each artist in the company represented by the percentage of revenue they contributed in those 5 years. So you got 7 representing 22%, you have very recently 2PM making a comeback with 3.7%, you got Day 6 with 3.7%, their youngest 4th gen groups, ITZY and Stray Kids, making their contribution, and this giant pink wall over here, yeah, that's TWICE. That's how much of the company they represent in terms of revenue. In what kind of bizarro world do we live in that people are actually debating whether a corporation is going to allow someone who's responsible for 52% of their revenue walk out of their front door? What is there to debate? It simply doesn't happen. But what if the artists really don't want to resign? What if they're just flat out done being a K-pop idol? Well, understandable. Imagine 7 years of constant dieting, lack of sleep, having to uphold a certain image whenever on camera, which is pretty much all the time, always looking behind your back for paparazzi or crazy sasaengs, and God forbid you're actually successful. I mean, the amount of pressure from your fans, media, your own company expecting you to eclipse your previous achievements every single comeback. And well, that's exactly what happened with these fellas. Just prior to BTS extending their contract back in 2018, they were legit considering disbanding. Ironically, for the exact opposite reasons most other groups disband. They were, in fact, too successful. And they were feeling an insurmountable amount of pressure, and due to the company wanting to take maximum advantage of their popularity, constantly being overworked. I mean, even today, the Korean government is actually considering giving BTS special exemption status from the military due to their cultural impact. And that is an enormous amount of pressure for a bunch of kids still in their 20s. Of course, Big Hit were certainly not about to let them leave, as at the time their current junior group TXT were still trainees, and all of the other major acquisitions hadn't happened yet, meaning BTS were responsible for nearly 100% of Big Hit's revenue. So Big Hit stepped in and said, hey, why don't you boys have a piece of our future IPO? Now, by the time the company went public, that piece turned out to be 1.4% equity in the company, equaling nearly 500,000 shares for a value of $108 million. BTS went from, I'm not sure if we want to go on, to, we're going to be with armies forever, very quickly. Yeah, $108 million has a way of doing that. But in the most unlikely scenario, if Twice decides not to renew with JYP, or rather JYP in his giant ego-inflated head thinks that Twice is somehow replaceable, well, things could potentially end very badly. For him. You see, JYP Entertainment is a public corporation owned by multiple shareholders. JYP is the acting COO, mostly in charge of the music production, although he is the single largest shareholder with about 15% shares. That's down from 18% because recently he sold 3% to a new business partner, Dunamu, an NFT company. Remind me to thank JYP for giving me a topic for a future video. The acting CEO is his right-hand man, Jungwook, aka Jimmy Jung, who owns about 8%. The majority shares are owned by the public, but there's also a combined 11% owned between two major companies, Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan Chase. If those names sound familiar, it should, as they're two of the largest investment banks in North America. And here's the thing about large investment banks. They really hate losing money. And they stand to lose a ton of money if word got out that Twice disbanded, causing all the public shareholders to dump their stocks faster than I could wash my eyes out after seeing this picture. You see, considering their stake in the company, they most likely have a seat on the board of directors. In order to prevent the public shareholders from panic selling, they'll most likely organize a shareholder meeting to discuss, or rather, point the finger at those two, and that reorganizing the company's management would fix all future issues. That would mean, depending on their corporate bylaws, JYP and his buddy Jimmy could be forced out of their executive positions in their own company. As much as that would suck for them, I would argue that this is still better than the alternative, where a bunch of deranged Twice fans rush into JYP's office and throw him out the window. You know the easiest way to avoid this problem? You take some advice from his buddy Bang Si-hyuk at Big Hit, and you give the girls whatever the hell they want. A personal Lego factory for Mina? Sure. Golden tickets to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory for Taeyeon? No problem. A pink Lamborghini for Momo? Why not? This is how it's done in the business world, and yes, even in the world of K-pop. So now that this drama is over, I'm gonna go back to my pina colada and look forward to the exciting fan wars that I'm sure are about to come when Twice release their English single next month. But until then, as always, thanks for watching. Champagne, my wine, my tequila, margarita, mojito with lime, sweet mimosa, pina colada, do 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 do, do 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 do.